Welcome back. We are in Basi Legani Tavshin Chavav, in the middle of Sif Dalid on page Chaf in this booklet. We're in the middle of the discussion about Mקיף. Where do we get to Mקיף? So very briefly to catch us up, to recap where we're holding in the Maimer. The Friedrich Rebbe is teaching in Perek Hazayin, the way the Rebbe is explaining it in this Maimer, that the level of Ein Sof L'mayla Mayla Ad Kates, the level of Ein Sof being high to no end, is the level of how Elikus of Ein Sof. So the nuance of that, as we described in the beginning of the Maimer, is we're talking about not Yecholos of Atzmus itself, we're not talking about Hashem, His essence Himself, but we're talking about the very first level of expression of Hashem, the very first level of Oyer of Hashem, that in our Maimer, that has the exact same characteristics of Atzmus, of the Ma'or. So we're talking about the way Hashem is expressing Himself, but this expression is entirely beyond the realm of this world. It doesn't have any limitations. It doesn't have any characteristics. In fact, the only way that we're describing it, not the only way, the way we're describing it is l'mayla la'adin kates u'lemata adin tachlis. At the very same time, in the very same space, it's l'mayla and l'mata, which means that it's nicely hefchim, which means that obviously that it contains opposites. But the point is that these opposites are real ideas, real levels. Now, what's this level of lamata? So lamata adin tachlis, and as a very real level, would be the way that Hashem allows Himself to be expressed. And remember, we're not talking about the way Hashem expressed Himself actually in the world, because we're going all the way back up to Ein Sof itself, the first level of Ar. So there's no world, there's no tzimtzum, there's no nothing. There's not even, we discussed at length, there's not even Esres First Agnuzais at this point. So there's nothing, but it's the way that Hashem reveals Himself, at least to Himself, in order to be able to later become revealed to the worlds. So then l'mayla adin kates in this sentence is the way that Hashem isn't even revealed to Himself, or in stronger words, the way Hashem is not begeder gilui klal. This is what we call stimu dechol sesimin. He's secret from all the secrets. Okay, so that's what we want to explain. This level of the highest level of stimu, the highest level of secrets, where Hashem is not only not practically revealed, He's not even begeder revealed. So in order to explain that, we brought in the concept of Mקיף. That there's Mקיף הקרוב, which is something that is not revealed, it's Mקיף, but it's close to revealed, it's karov, so it's relative to revealed. And then there's Mקיף הרחוק. So that's where we're holding. We're holding that the level that we want to talk about in our Maimer. So in other words, it's Ein Sof L'mayla Adin Kates. In other words, it's Stimu Dechol Sesimin. In other words, it's the way that Hashem is hidden even from Him, even to Himself. That is Mקיף harachok. So in order to explain what Mקיף harachok is, we first went back last week to explain what Mקיף in general is, and we had Ba'arucha, the idea from the Tzemach Tzedek and Derech Mitzvah, the concept of Ratzain, the desire of a person, as opposed to the koiches pnimim. Not to go all back into that discussion that was last week's, but let's remember that mashal of Ratzain, because the concept of Ratzain will still come up again. Not with all those details of Ratzain versus pnimi, but the concept of Ratzain. Okay. So that's how we ended off, the idea of Mקיף in general, Mקיף versus Pnimi, Ratzain versus Koiches Pnimim, and now we're going into the difference between Mקיף hakarov and Mקיף harachok. That's where we're holding. Again, where's that heading? Where are we heading with this? So let's again remember the bigger picture, that we're heading to explain what is this highest level of the deepest secret. V'hinei gam beinin haratzin shuhu b'vchinas Mקיף yeshnam beis dargos. So on page Chaf, the second paragraph. So even within Ratzin itself, which is Mקיף, there are two levels. Mקיף hakarov and Mקיף harachok. There's the close Mקיף and the far Mקיף. So notice how the Rebbe right away didn't just say in the inyan of Mקיף there's two Mקיfim. He said in the inyan of Ratzain, which is Mקיף, there's two levels. So yes, the Rebbe will tie it back in Avodah to two types of Ratzin, as we're going to see a beautiful discussion in this paragraph. But again, for now, let's just zoom out of Ratzin as a specific concept of a person's desire. Let's talk about in general two ideas of Mקיף. So to explain this, this is explained at length in a beautiful Maimer in L'Kutei Torah. It's towards the end of L'Kutei Torah in Parshas V'Zos Bracha. So it's towards the end. It's a Maimer that's Dibur Maschel Mizmor Shir Chanukah Sabayis LeDavid, and it's a whole Maimer about the concept of a house, the concept of a bayis. It was a Maimer that was said. Abaya Chanukah Sabayis. There's different versions of the Maimer, and according to one version of the Maimer was said by the famous Chasser Pinchas Reizes, And as we know, he was a chassid in Shklav, which was a city of Misnagdim, and he was originally himself from Misnagid, and he became a chassid Alter Rebbe. He was very wealthy, and he built himself a house, a proper house, a house out of brick and stone, not just wood. So it would last one fire, in the shtetl. And he was very wealthy, and it was a big deal. And one version of this mimer was said by the Alter Rebbe by the Chanukas Abayis, by Pinchas Reizes in his house as a Indian, and the Alter Rebbe is talking about the concept of a house. Derech Agav, it's a well-known story. It's a beautiful story, but I heard a share from Rabbi Yosef Klein from Nyack, and he talked about the fact that this mimer was said by that in that context, and with the famous story that we know, he shows how it's actually very connected to the Teichen of the mimer. It's a beautiful idea we'll explain soon. But the story is that the Alter Rebbe asked Reb Pinchas Reizes, why do you need such a big house? Why do you need such a fancy house? And Reb Pinchas Reizes answered that being that now that I have a fancy house, all the meetings of Shklav will happen in my house, because they're happening in my house. So now I'll have a dayah, I'll have an opinion. There was a Misnagish city, and this is the time of the bitter machloikas. So it's very important for the Chassidim to be able to have an opinion and to be able to have representation. So it said the fact that it's going to happen in my house, that gives me representation, that gives me a dayah. And according to one version of the story, he spelled it out. He said the meeting is going to happen in my house, and therefore the Chassidish Melamed, the Melamedim in general poor, so the Chassidish Melamed and Shklav will be able to have parnasa. In other words, that there's of course it's not stam out of wanting to have a big house, but it's in order for a purpose in Avodas Hashem. It's a beautiful story in and of itself. We'll see how it's actually very connected to the Teichen of the Maimer that we're about to explain. So anyways, in that Maimer, in Likutei Torah, which is Mizmor Shir Chanukas Abayis, all about a Chanukas Abayis, the Alter Rebbe is Mayrich to explain what is the idea of a house. So Alter Rebbe says, excuse me, Alpi Mashal Gashmi Yoiser Me'achiluk Shebein Levush Abayis. So let's get more specifically into, as we see, the physical difference between clothing and a house. She'af Sheshneim Nikroim B'Shem Makifim. And in order to show the difference between clothing and a house, let's appreciate the comparison. Let's appreciate why we're trying to explain the difference. Because both clothing and a house are both makif, both surround the person. Now, we're not in our part of the mimer, but in that mimer, those two, clothing and a house, would be contrasted to food. And that's how the Alter Rebbe starts with the mimer. There's three things that a person needs: food, clothing, and a house. So food is pnimius. As we always talk about, the Alter Rebbe talks about, he has an expression in Tanya, we always quote it, that na'sa damu vasar kibsare. When a person eats food, it becomes part of who they are. So physically, you're putting the food into your body, but that shows on a deeper concept, not just that it's physically entering your body, but conceptually, the food is becoming part of who you are. There's a very, very intrinsic and very personal connection between the person and the food that he eats. So that's pnimi. And we're jumping straight to two levels of makif. So in our part of the mimer, the Rebbe is not even quoting that part of the Alter Rebbe, but he starts off by contrasting pnimi versus makif. In makif itself, there is the levush, the garments that a person wears, which again, physically we see that the person is wearing them around his body, and not just physically, but conceptually, that also shows that the clothing are makif to the person. We'll explain in a second. Then there's also the person's house. And a house, obviously, is makif, it surrounds the person as well. But there's a difference. Fourth line in the paragraph, there's absolutely a difference between the clothing and a house. Garments are makif, they surround the person, but a house surrounds this that surrounds. Now, what does that mean? So first, physically. The Rebbe Marash picks up on this point in his hemshech called Maim Rabim from Tafresh Lamed Vav. And again, in going through all the Rabbeim in Basi Legani, we're now by the Rebbe Marash. We're going to quote another vart from the Rebbe Marash soon in this paragraph, which is seemingly even bigger vart, so to speak. But already here, the Rebbe Marash picks up on the same conversation of the Alter Rebbe in this Maimer, but explains it with a very beautiful expression of it. Shalavushu b'kir of gadol elam mislabish boy. Yes, a garment is makif, a garment surrounds the person. But what's very interesting, the paradox over here is that it needs to surround the person exactly. Thank you. It needs to surround the person to the T, exactly how the person is. So not just it's literally touching you, but it needs to be fitted to the person's size. The Rebbe brings from other places in Chassidus, famously a mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzisecha, she'im halavush einei asri lefi midas guf adam ve'varav, that if a person is wearing a garment that's not fitted to his size, not only does it not help the person, not only does it not protect the person and bring him respect, etc., which clothing all do, on the contrary, it actually is harmful, it's counterproductive. Simply the way he says it is that the person could trip over his garments if they're too big. But in the Tzemach Tzedek's Maimer, it's a famous word that the Rebbe quotes very often in letters. It's a word in B'tachin. The Tzemach Tzedek uses it as a mashal for B'tachin because he says that we always talk about making a keli. He gives the example of work. So you need to make a keli to make money, to have to go to work to get parnasa to make money. But as we know, that's only a keli for the bracha of Hashem, and the main thing is the bracha of Hashem. So he says, let's understand the idea of the keli like a levush. He says, yeah, a person needs garments, he needs clothing, and he says this oisprach. He says, but the clothing need to be exactly the right size, not less, not more. A person could think, if garments are a good thing, so the more fabric I have, the more garments I'm wearing, so to speak, so then the better it is. And the answer is no. It needs to be exact, no less than what's needed, but no more than what's needed. And if it's more, then not only will not help, but it'll make worse. And the Tzemach Tzedek uses this point as a mashal that's so too kelim that we use for parnasa or any other keli that a person needs, begashmis, going to a doctor, whatever kelim a person needs to do begashmis, yes, we need to do them, can have less than what's needed, right? Taseh, sheisham teosim malacha, sheisham tavi, the person needs to do work, but it can't be any more than what's needed. Many letters of the Rebbe about B'tachin, the Rebbe quotes this idea that a person should not get overly involved and overly obsessive about the kelim that he's using, whether it's parnasa, whether it's going to a doctor, etc., because use this idea of a levush that it needs to be fitted. It needs to be no less, but also no more. Okay, so using that word to the Rebbe Mara, it's but now back to our idea. So garments, yes, it's makif, but it's a makif hakariv. We appreciate that. Number one, it's literally on the person's body, but number two, it's very tailor-made. So it's fascinating because that's usually the exact definition we use for pnimi. Pnimi usually we define as something that's tailor-made, something that's individualized. Clothing, right? Because in our mimer we want to get to makif harachik, so we're going to majorly, throw makif hakariv under the bus, so to speak. We're going to bring out the very pnimistic elements that makif hakariv has over here. That yes, it's makif, but it's kariv. It's absolutely very kariv. It's kariv to pnimius. In other words, it literally has the dimensions of the person. Bottom line on the page, as opposed to a house, which again, number one, it's far from the person, but also using that idea for a contrast to the clothing, it doesn't need to be the size of the person inside. And the Rebbe puts in here the Rebbe's own words, top line of page Chaf Aleph. To the point that you could have one house in which many people are living that are very different from each other. And it's a fascinating idea. It's a beautiful idea in the Rebbe's words. And again, I heard from Rabbi Klein, who is a Baki in Chassidus, that this is the Rebbe's Chiddush. This oisprach of explaining the makif of a house, that it could encompass many different people that are different from each other. So that's the Rebbe's Chiddush and how to express this, and it's a beautiful way because what do we mean? What do we talk about? As we're going to talk about at length later in the paragraph, a house is very important, right? The Alter Rebbe's premise starting off the mimer. There's three things that a person needs: clothing, food, and shelter. What's shelter? Shelter is clothing and a house. Person needs a house, and we're going to spell this out soon in the paragraph. So you would think that if a person needs a house, and as we're going to see how much a person needs a house, so then also it should have some very specific connection to the person. And the answer is no, it doesn't. Because you can have two people living under the same roof, in other words, getting the same very, very vital necessity of a person, which is shelter, and two people that are very different from each other. Obviously, we could think about the image of the clothing mashal, so they're different in size, begashmis, but not just size, begashmis. You can have people that are very different in every area of life. They're different ideologically and spiritually and physically, on totally different extremes, and yet they're under the same roof, which is not just a technical thing, which is a massive thing, because a house is very necessary. So that shows the impersonalization of the necessity of what a house provides. That's makif harachik. It's not just actually not to the person himself. It's very diametrically opposed to the concept of personalization, to what a person needs himself. And again, in the Rebbe's words, the raya is because very different people could use the same function of the house. Okay, So that's the Alter Rebbe's idea in his mimer of the difference between garments and house. We're still going to get back to some more ideas that the Alter Rebbe gives in that mimer. But in the meantime, the Rebbe interrupts with a note of the Tzemach Tzedek in that mimer. So we're back to the Tzemach Tzedek for a second. And this is very beautiful because it's not just throwing in a vart of the Tzemach Tzedek, which is in the mimer of the Likutei Torah, but it actually ties us back to last year's discussion of Ratzon. And we talk about in Avodah and how this looks in Avodah Sab Adam. Very geschmack. The second line of Peish Chafal from Mizeh Yuvan Gambin in Ratzon. So now that we understand the picture of Makiv HaRachik and Makiv HaKarov, and again in a very easy, basic mashal begashmias, garments and clothing, we're still going to go to explain beruchnias, what Makiv HaRachik and Makiv HaKarov are, but we already just have it begashmias. So now we could tie this idea of Makiv HaKarov and Makiv HaRachik back to Makiv in general. Makiv in general we said is Ratzon. So now let's describe two levels within Ratzon. A Ratzon that's like Makiv HaKarov and a Ratzon that's like Makiv HaRachik. Let's see. So as Tzemach Tzedek mentions in his note in Likutei Torah on this mimer of the Alter Rebbe, regarding the topic of Na'asa v'Nishma, so a very beautiful concept, Na'asa v'Nishma, and discussed obviously at length in Chassidus, many different places in Chassidus. And here the Tzemach Tzedek has a fascinating twist on the sugi of Na'asa v'Nishma, and it's very unique over here. Usually, what we talk about Na'asa v'Nishma, and even on a very basic level, as we explained even to children, that Na'asa means to do, which means that you're batul to Hashem. Nishma is that we will hear, we will understand, we'll figure it out. Seichel, which describes a little bit more the person as a metzias for himself. In other words, bittul versus lack of bittul. And that's why we explain, again, even on a basic level to children, but also in Chassidus, in the explanations of Na'asa and Nishma, that's how we explain why Na'asa needs to come before Nishma. Because Nishma is like a little bit not so great on its own, so to speak. But Na'asa is great because the Yidden were committed to do whatever it is that Hashem says to do. That's the ultimate bittul, right? And that's why we got the crowns. So first of all, there's one diuk that Chassidus mentions a lot, including that Tzemach Tzedek in this mimer, that no, the crown wasn't for Na'asa before Nishma. Nishma, the Malachim came and gave the Yidden crowns, two crowns, echad keneged Na'asa ve'echad keneged Nishma. That means that there's a power in Nishma itself. But on the other hand, we're saying that they got the crowns because they were makdim Na'asa before Nishma. That's why we usually talk about it. Oh yeah, Na'asa before Nishma. But then we're saying Echo Keneged Na'asa ve'Echo Keneged Nishma. That means that Nishma itself is powerful. So many places in Chassidus talk about this. We learned a few years ago. We learned a beautiful mimer of the Rebbe, Tavshin Chavtes, and we'll look at where the Rebbe explains very barucha about the power of Nishma by itself. But the Tzemach Tzedek touches upon that as well over here. It means that Nishma also is bittul. Not like the way we by default associate that. No, Na'asa is bittul. Nishma is already your own seichel, which obviously is not bad, but you need to have Na'asa because you need to have bittul. Zakta Tzemach Tzedek, we could divide it, we could go even deeper. Na'asa is bittul, Nishma is bittul, but it's a very different type of bittul. On a very edula level. Here we go. He starts with the premise that both Na'asa and Nishma are that you're saying, I'm going to do Hashem's will. I'm going to fulfill Hashem's will. Ratzon. We're connecting to Hashem's Ratzon. He says, yeah, within that context, that they're both bittul, Na'asa is a greater bittul. Why? Because you're being mivatal, you're bittul. You're being mivatal your entire ratzon, that not only you have a ratzon to be batal, you don't have ratzon at all. What does that mean? The Rebbe explains in the brackets, v'hainu, meaning, nishma. So let's go backward. Let's start with nishma to show what nishma is, and then we'll see how Na'asa is greater. It says nishma is not what we usually translate that nishma means we'll understand with our seichel. It says nishma is even more, it is also that. That's the pashut pshat. It says nishma is also that we're going to fully absorb what Hashem wants, which means that we'll have a bittul, that we're going to align our ratzon, not just our seichel, our ratzon, that our desires should be aligned with Hashem's desires. Which, that's fantastic. That a person should only want what Hashem wants, right? Halavai, right? That's already a massive avodah. El Yiseder Mizeh, he says, that's nishma. And more than that, shuin in bittul haratzin legamri, more than that is where I'm not even focusing on what I want. Even not that what I want is what Hashem wants. Because at the end of the day, on the most in the deepest level, that's my desire. It's beautiful. Your desire is Mamash Hashem's desire. Yeah, but it's your desire. That's Nishma. Na'asa is I don't even have that desire. I don't even have that desire to do what Hashem wants. I'm just gonna do. I'm just gonna do. That's why the focus of that word is we will do. I'm going to do what Hashem wants. I don't have any desires. Now, let's not get lost that in different places in Chassidus, in different contexts, we're going to highlight one over the other. And there's plenty of Amarim, including ones that we have learned, that will focus on the Maila of Nishma, absolutely. And that will focus on the Maila of developing the Metzias of the person, especially in the Rebbe's Mamarim, developing the Metzias of the person. And yes, the person's Metzias should be fully developed and aligned with Hashem. And in a way, that's the ultimate Dir B'Tachtoinim, that you have the Metzias of the person that's functioning, that yes, he has his Seichel and his Midos and his Ratzin. Absolutely. But there are other Mamarim in other contexts where the focus is not maybe the Dir B'Tachtoinim and the completion and the subscription of all the entire creation to be aligned with Hashem, but the focus, a different context where we're looking for actually the lack of anything else. The Achdus Pshuta of Hashem. And in that context, which is what we're focusing on here, in that context, then Nasa is even greater than Nishma, because Nasa is not even I will want what Hashem wants, it's that I don't exist. And the most important thing is that the action should get done. I do exist because I need to do the mitzvah, and yes, absolutely, in that sense, we're still even in this sense, there's a dir b'tachtoinim. Hashem wants to get done, but in this sense, it's not about anything else other than the bottom line, getting it done. And let's pause for a second. Let's talk avodah. Let's brain for a second. That this is so important. It's so important to have both of these very clear perspectives. That sometimes we are in position to, maybe we're a little bit more inspired, maybe we're a little bit more open, maybe we're a little bit more in a better place, and we're able to lift ourselves higher, which means we're able to actually rewire the way we think and the way we naturally act and react and what we want and our agendas to be aligned with Hashem, right? By a farbrengen, and when we're koching in something divine, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, this is geschmack, right? So when you say that this is geschmack, that means that now your psyche, what you like, your tainugim, your ratzin, your seichel, your midas are aligned with what Hashem wants, and that's beautiful, and that's important, and it's necessary. We need to be able to lift ourselves higher. We need to be able to have that inspiration that we shouldn't always fall back to needing to fight our Yetzer Hara. We need to be able to develop where we are bought in and we want it. And that's Nishma. And at the same time, we also need to be able to fall back to, it doesn't matter what I want. It doesn't matter if I'm in the mood or not. Sometimes we're not in the mode or the mood to be able to rely on that we are inspired and that we are aligned with what Hashem wants. Sometimes, maybe many times, we're in a space, especially when it's winter and it's snowing outside, where we're not in the mood and it's all blah and it's dull and it's and then it's pashut. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm not even going to try to inspire myself right now. I know that I need to get it done. I'm going to get it done. Nishma is where I'm bought in. I'm aligned. And Nasa is there's no I. There's no I. It's just getting it done. I need to exist. I need to be a physical human being in order to get it done, but only as a vehicle. I don't matter in an I, in a personality way, not even in the most divine and aligned personality way, because then we could very subtly get caught up in my existence as opposed to Hashem's desire of getting the mitzvah done. And to finish off one last time, it's very important to appreciate. We're not throwing Nishma under the bus here. We're not saying, classic bittul, and no, you don't exist, you don't matter. That's Nishma. That's important for itself. But in our Maimer, in our context, where the focus is the ultimate bittul, because remember, why we were looking for the ultimate bittul here? Because we're looking for the ultimate makif. Makif harchok. Makif means that, especially makif harchok, means it's not about you, right? So in that sense, that's why we're after the bittul element here. And the bittul element over here, the focus is out. Na'asa doesn't even focus on the bittul of the person. It's mevatel even the bittul of the person, so to speak. Back inside, right after the brackets, about 7-8 lines in from the top. Umevaer. So Zakta Tzemach Tzedek, this idea of Na'asa v'nishma, where again Na'asa means the highest level of bittul. She'inyan zeh nimshach mebechinas raiva dechol raiven. This is in Chabad. It's definitely a very familiar line. Raiva de raiven, right? We talk about the Shabbos afternoon after Mincha. That's why we do a Maimer then, and we use the lashon from Kabbalah. Raiva de raiven. A little translation. Raiva de raiven means rotzain dir ritzoinos. Raiva means rotzing. So Zakta Tzemach Tzedek, Makif, as we've been saying throughout, Makif is rotzing. So when Kabbalah talks about the rotzin of all ritzoinos, that's basically saying the Makif of all Makifim, and the Hainu rotzin, and that is Makif harachik. Okay, so what do we have so far? We have that we discussed rotzin as a mashal for Makif. Then we went to a separate mashal of Makif two types of makif, makif akariv, makif harchok, levush and bias. So what the Rebbe just did was he brought in the Tzemach Tzedek's Haggah to tie back the two types of makif to the general concept of ratzon. To the general concept of ratzon. So you have two types of ritzonos. You have a ratzon of makif akarv and a ratzon makif harchok. So let's spell that out now. So a ratzon of makif akarv as a ratzon means let's go one level down. Let's go to pnimi. Pnimi means me as a person, me as an individual. So makif harchok means the ratzon, the bittul, but the bittul that still focuses on me as an individual, and that's what we described as nishma, where I am being batal. My ratzon is aligned with Hashem's ratzon. Makif harchok means, and again, using the imagery of the house to appreciate the rachokness of this makif, means that it's total bittul without any focus on me as an individual, which is that na'asa, that I'm just getting it done without even my ratzon, not even my ratzon being aligned to Hashem's ratzon. So now back to the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. The Alter Rebbe shows this how we see this concept in practical avodah. Where do you see this in fulfilling a mitzvah? So Alter Rebbe in that Maimer explains we see that there's two types of mitzvahs. Ha'alef, stam kol ha-mitzvahs, almost all mitzvahs, sheheim b'rtzono shel adam la'asosam, where the person decides to do them. The person wants to do the mitzvah. And this means decide that the person is interested b'chlal, or the person is forcing himself to do it. That's not the point here. The point is that the person is, actively choosing to do the mitzvah. So that is the person's desire, that's connected to Hashem's desire, but the basic level of desire. Because they're coming from a place connected to Hashem's desire, it comes out as the person's desire. And importantly, by doing that kind of mitzvah, he connects to Hashem's Ratzon Elyon. Alter explains that's why when we do a mitzvah, we make the bracha that by doing mitzvahs, Hashem makes us holy. And as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that holy always, the word Kodesh, the word holy means separate. Kodesh, in fact, literally in Torah, Kodesh, the Shorish Kodesh is used as something separate, something different. It could even be used in a negative connotation. Usually not, obviously. Usually we talk about positively separate, positively different, and that's what we call divine and holy. But the word Kodesh means separate. So Asher Kedshonu b'mitzvah, when we do a mitzvah, we are becoming separate. We are becoming divided and distinguished. And in the context of Chassidus and Kabbalah, what that means is that we're drawing down, by doing a mitzvah, we're drawing down a that is separate, the that is makif. And all mitzvahs draw down different levels of makifim. And so that's all focus on ratzon. And starting from Hashem's ratzon, but then importantly over here, focusing on the person's ratzon, that the person is deciding to do the mitzvah. Okay, as opposed to what? But then there are mitzvahs that have nothing to do with the person's desire. On the contrary, the only way for the mitzvah to be done is when the person does not want to do it. What in the world? So the example that's given, that the Rebbe gives, is the mitzvah of shechicha, which is when the person forgets, when the Jewish farmer forgets stalks of wheat in his field, and the mitzvah is now he has to leave them for the poor, he can't go back to take them. That's a mitzvah, shekol mitzvah, he dafke b'efen shel heder haratzon. The entire existence of that mitzvah, the only way to do that mitzvah is dafke when you don't want to. If you want to leave that for the poor, that's nice, that's tzedakah, but it's not the mitzvah of shechicha, as its own individual mitzvah of the 613 mitzvahs. You cannot plan. It's a fascinating trivia. What's the only mitzvah you can't plan for? And the answer is shechicha. You can't plan for shechicha. In fact, Alter Rebbe quotes a beautiful brisa. He says Alter Rebbe in the Maimer quotes Tosefta, Nesachas Peah, which is where it talks about shechicha. It says, "Ma'aseh b'chassid echad." There's a story with one chassid. The chassid means a person of who cared about mitzvahs. Sheshachach omer b'seich sedeu. He forgot a bundle in his field, right? Amar livnoi, and then when he realized that he forgot in the field, he told his son, "Tzei v'hakri v'lai par lo'ila par l'shlamim." Beautiful. Let's make a simcha now. Bring karbanis. Bring a oila shlamim. Amar lo'i Abba Madre Yisrael smech b'simchas mitzvah mikol mitzvah shebetayra. What's the big deal? Okay, you did a mitzvah of shechicha. I get it. you do mitzvahs all day. What's dafka this mitzvah? Amar lo'i, he told the son, no. Kol mitzvah shebetayra nasan lahem amokim l'daitenu. Hashem gave them over to our das, to our decision. Zu sheloi l'daitenu. This one is not based on our decision. She'ilu asinuhu beratzain lifnei hamakim. If I would have forgotten it willingly in the field, like bas mitzvah zu liyadenu then I would never be able to do the mitzvah. It can only be done if I forget. So now I have to thank Hashem, especially for allowing me to do this mitzvah, because it's up to Hashem for me to do this mitzvah. It's a Tosefta. He's quoting Tosefta. Yeah. So beautiful. Mamish straight up. That's the idea, and he used that exact words. L'rtzainenu or l'daitenu says that if it was just for our das, then we wouldn't be able to shi'u asinu b'ratzain. Use that word. If we would have done it from our own desire, it wouldn't be done. It can't do the mitzvah. Now, let's put in. It's very important to put in over here. So Alter Rebbe is using this example to show that there are some mitzvahs that are not totally b'ratzain, and that shows that these mitzvahs have an even deeper connection, which is not your ratzain, but it's completely Hashem's ratzain. And it's not the level of Hashem's ratzain that's totally on your ratzain that matches. It's the raiva. It's the ratzain of the ratzainis, or as we're calling here, the makif harachik, the makif of makifim. Let's put in it. We have to appreciate that. Okay, so we found one example. There's one mitzvah. Now, Rebbe starts out the discussion. There's two types of mitzvahs. Not really. There's 612 and then there's one, right? So what do you mean two types of mitzvahs? The point is deeper. The point is this shows us on something deeper that exists within the concept of mitzvahs, and that a yid should be able to tap in any mitzvah. And that's what the Rebbe spoke about before, quoting from the Tzemach Tzedek, the concept of Na'asa before Nishm'a, meaning the deeper type of bittul. So in strict halacha, we found it in one mitzvah, but it opens up our understanding, our awareness that in the sugya of ratzin, of Hashem's ratzin for mitzvahs, there exists a deeper ratzin of Hashem, where Hashem could bring the person, and it's only up to Hashem, and therefore Yid could appreciate that there's this level of bittul within mitzvahs that's bittul even from bittul. In other words, bittul even from ratzin. Okay. Another example that the Alter Rebbe gives in this mimer, also such as the concept of nesius, and obviously we need to appreciate that. This is a Yod Shvat mimer, and obviously very telling. What's the meaning of nesius? What's the meaning of being a nasi, of being a leader? The only way a person could be a leader is if he doesn't want to be a leader. If he's escaping from it. Sha'arei, as the Gemara tells us, that anyone who pursues and chases after honor, so the honor actually runs away from him. Now the Alter Rebbe in the Maimer quotes a Gemara in Yerushalmi, which says a Maisa with Shimon ben Shatach, who ran away to Mitzrayim not to be the Nasi, and they chased him down to Mitzrayim and they made him the Nasi. And the way the Alter Rebbe quotes the story, it's mashma that if he wouldn't have ran away to Mitzrayim, then he wouldn't have become the Nasi. So obviously we can appreciate it. We're not talking about there was once a Maggid who said, and he says, not like the dog that's chasing that's running around in a circle trying to chase his tail, and so not like the person who's running away from kavod, but he keeps on looking back to make sure that the kavod is taka running after him, right? So obviously we're not talking about that, especially when we're talking about a real story. Shimon ben Shatach was obviously a tzaddik, but bichlal, we're talking about a very real concept where the person is specifically trying to run away from this level of kavod. And by the way it's explained in Chassidus, kavod doesn't just mean ego and glorification. Kavod also means high levels of giluyim, right? And also begashmis, right? To somebody who someone becomes a leader, also beruchnis, that shows on a very high level. That's why that's why there's a lot of spiritual energy that's associated with that. So this person is running away from all that. Again, not just the gashmis, the kavod, he's running away from these giluyim. In other words, the only way to get these giluyim is dafke by not reaching them, by dafke being bottle. If the person's running after the kavod, then the kavod will run away and he won't be able to get the nesias. So only someone who runs away from the kavod that will get him. So again, bring out this concept of makif harachik, that the only way for this to happen is dafka by the bittul, the absolute bittul of the person, and bringing it back to the concept of mitzvahs. So mitzvahs elu sharsha mebichinas shel mayla me'aratzain shenikra makif lemakif. Okay. So what do we have so far? We have the mashal of the difference of levushim and bias. Levushim is makif hakariv, bias is makif harachik. That told us that also in ratzin. Ratzin is makif, that there's two types of ratzainis. Ratzin hakariv and ratzin harachik. We explained what that means in Na'asa and Nishm'a. We explained what that means in Kiyum mitzvahs by using the mitzvah of shichacha as an example, where sometimes mitzvahs could only be done, or in other words, there is an element within mitzvahs which necessitates the person's entire bittul and total lack of any form of feeling. And now zooming out more than just within mitzvahs, b'chlalos harei zeh hachiluk shebei mitzvahs l'Torah. Generally, in Chassidus, this is also the difference between mitzvahs and Torah. Shebe'erech zeh lozeh nikreim mitzvahs b'shem levushim. That relative to each other, mitzvahs are called levushim. And in brackets, this is a common concept in Chassidus, Uchyadua b'Pirush, v'Avram Zakim b'Bayamim. As it's known, that Chassidus teaches the pasuk, Avram was old, coming with his days. Dikoya levushei hamitzvos, that the days are, what do you mean, coming with his days? It means that as he was advancing in age, he brought all his days with him. And the Chassidus explains from Zohar, from Kabbalah, that the days is a reference to levushim, the levushim of mitzvahs, that every day that passed in Avram's life, he advanced with that day. He had the accomplishments of that day in a way that he wasn't lacking anything that needed to be done on that day. And Chassidus talks in general on that concept about the importance of not just having a sum total of mitzvahs, but that every specific moment, every specific opportunity is an opportunity that cannot be missed in as of itself. Because the fact that this opportunity exists means that this opportunity needs to be elevated. Not just the sum total that, throughout my life I've done this and this, but that I've used every opportunity that came to me, because every opportunity is this levush that the person could acquire reaching the goal. So we see that mitzvahs in Chassidus are called levushim, but what we want to focus on here, v'toyer nikris b'shem bayis. In this context, relative to mitzvahs being levushim, being makif, Torah is bias, Torah is the makif harchok. Now, we have to put in here, this is a big deal, because usually in Chassidus, we talk about how Torah is pnimi, basic Tanya Parakeh, the whole Vart, and throughout Tanya, many places, that the Alter Rebbe brings out the difference in Torah and mitzvahs. Torah is pnimi, Torah envelops the person, and there's a yichud niflosh and yichud kamayu that becomes one with the person, pnimi, and mitzvahs is levush. Here, we're saying, no. Torah, mitzvah is levush, that is makif, and Torah is makif harchok. So obviously, the Rebbe doesn't get into it over here, but obviously there's different elements within Torah. There's the seichel of Torah, and that's what is the pnimi. That's what Alter Rebbe is talking about over there in Parakeh Tanya. The seichel of Torah becomes one with the person, and that's what Alter Rebbe goes on to explain. We quoted it earlier in the Maimer, how any seichel becomes one with the person. The brain envelops the matter becomes one with the knowledge becomes one with the brain. It's internalized, it's personalized, etc. We're obviously talking about here a concept of Torah that's not the seichel element of Torah. And let's appreciate it in the broader context, absolutely, because we're talking about bittul. So we're talking about something that Torah gives the person that's beyond just, for sure beyond the seichel of Torah, and not only, and in that sense it's even more powerful than the accomplishment of a mitzvah, but we're talking about how Torah totally envelops the person in a makif harchok way, in a way that's beyond the person's mitzias. It's the ultimate bittul. Okay, so why? Why is Torah called a house? So now let's appreciate more. Let's dive more into this concept of the house. And here we're going to go back to that Maimer there by Marash that we started quoting before. As explained at length by the Rebbe Marash in Hemshech Maim Rabim, just like a house guards the person. So let's focus on this element of the house, not the way it's far off from the person, not the way that it's not about the person's existence. Let's focus on the effect that it has. And the Rebbe Marash focuses on the Pashta Zach, that the house is shelter. It protects the person from the cold, from the rain. V'chein gam shmir salavushim hi b'bayis dafka. Zak Rebbe Marash, and what else gets protected? The clothing of the person gets protected. So this is the protection over the protection. It's the shelter of the shelter. The clothing of the person's shelter, and the house shelters also that shelter. It shelters the garments. Keinu gam b'negel Torah mitzvahs. So, period. So the Rebbe Marash explains the same thing with Torah mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are the levush of the person. Mitzvahs are that accomplishment that the person has. Torah, in this sense, what's the makif of Torah? What's the makif harchok of Torah? Is that it protects. What does that mean, it protects? So the Rebbe doesn't spell it out, but let's put in what the Rebbe Marash explains. The Torah makes sure that the person with the mitzvah that he's doing it never gets caught up in the person's mitzvahs, in the person's ego, in the person's yeshus. The Torah is the shmira. The Torah makes sure that it's always aligned with Hashem, that the person's always bottled to Hashem. Let's spell it out. How, why, what about Torah? So again, it's not the seichel part of Torah. Seichel part of Torah, Chas Shalom could make a person even more egotistic. But we're talking about that the way that Torah is one with Hashem, and therefore when a Yid learns Torah, as we say, that there's the very essence of Hashem within Torah. When a Yid learns Torah, yes, besides the seichel element of it, he's now in Hashem's mind. He's now in Hashem's world. He's in Hashem's reality. Obviously, a person has to choose to tap into this. But the power of Torah, and all the Padav Shalom Amarim, talking about the Padiyah of Shalom that happens through Torah, the power of Torah is, meaning that there's the Hashem sends down His very energy, His very essence, when a Yid learns Torah. So as opposed to when the Yid does a mitzvah, which at the end it's a bittul to Hashem, sure, nasa, like we said before, but it's the person as a person doing the mitzvah. Torah enables the person to lose himself. Not the seichel element of Torah, because the seichel element of Torah, the person has to dafka focus on his seichel. But Torah comes with this available connection to Hashem, where Hashem says, now it's you lose yourself within me. So this focuses a lot on what the Gemara tells us, that when a person learns Torah, it has to be by Matan Torah, the Gemara says. And Chassidus quotes a lot what it says about that when a person learns Torah, it has to be that when a person learns Torah, his perspective has to be, I am learning Hashem's words. Yes, I need to understand it with my seichel, sure. And that's one element of Torah, and that's the pnimi element of Torah. But I have to understand with my seichel what? Hashem's Torah. And I have to know every second of my learning Torah, and definitely consciously before I start learning, that this is Hashem's Torah. Let's say in the Chanukah Mamarim famously, right? That's the whole concept of Lashkichim Torah Secha, Torah Hashem, right? Very common concept in many sugyas and chassidus, how Torah needs to have, and not just needs to have as a bonus, the yisoid of Torah is this bittul to Hashem. As Rebbe famously quotes, V'nafshi ka'ofar lakol tiyah psachli b'b'sar secha. Pash pshat, those are two different sentences. But Zakter Rebbe, no. Only after V'nafshi ka'ofar lakol tiyah, only when a person has this absolute bittul to Hashem, then psachli b'b'sar secha, then he could really tap into b'sar secha to Hashem's Torah. So this is all we brought. We had a lot of concepts over here, mainly focusing on the house, the makiff, akariv, makiff harchok, levush, bayis, nasa, nishmah, rotzin, two types of rotzin. All this was a nice collection of the Torah of the previous Rebbeim. Zakter Rebbe, now the Rebbe picks up back to his focus of the whole Maimer. What are we discussing here? Makiff harchok, right? And now we got really into makiff harchok. And what do we see about makiff harchok? What do we keep on focusing on? The bittul, the absolute bittul, right? Na'sa, bayis, the shichacha, right? All these examples. What do they all bring out? The total lack of the mitzias of the person. Zakter Rebbe, let's not lose sight of where we're trying to go. And as the Rebbe always does, not ki'ilu as like a new chiddush. Let's tap into the oimek of what the Rebbe we're talking about. So let's use those exact last words of the Rebbe Marash, the bias. The bias is the ma'kiv harchok, right? 1 second. But it's shomer on the person. And the whole power is that it's shomer on the person. That means that there is a focus on the person. Right? So this constant loop. So we're back to where we were trying to get to in the Maimer, where yes, Makif Harachik, Stimu de Chosimin, Aryan Seif Lamal and the Kates, all those words, but as the Rebbe said, we need to focus and we need to understand, we need to bring out how it's a Or Makif, how it's Makif Al Ha'adam, how it's Oirein Seif. So it's Or, it's an expression. There's something happening here, there's an experience. So where we landed, which is the Rebbe Marash's focus about how the bias has an effect on the person, beautiful, yes, let's focus on that. It does have an effect on the person. 4 lines from the bottom of the page. So from all this, we understand the power of the Makif Harachik. Indeed, it's far from the person. Again, the Chiddush of the Rebbe in this discussion. Let's focus on how it is Makif on the person. And yes, even Makif Harachik, and it does affect him. It gives him that shmirah. And in broader terms, and in many, many places, the Rebbe Chassidus and the Rebbe talk about this concept. The Gemara says, "Kol mi she'ein lo bayis ein lo adam." Person doesn't have a home; he's not a person. A person needs to have a home. A human being, by definition. So yeah, a person also needs food, and a person also needs garments. Sure, but we define a person by the house, by his house. Now, that's what I mean. That's not what we're talking about. That Viter goes into the person. That's pnimi. That's Makav Akariv maybe. But we see that even in Makif Harachik, even in discussion of a home, it gives the person his anchor, it gives the person his place, right? And by the way, let's like in the theme of Dir B'Tachtonim, of Basi Legani, what's the whole point? If Hashem wants a dira, how do we teach that? It always explains that Hashem wants to be expressed, Hashem wants to be comfortable, Hashem wants a world where we look at the world and we see Him, right? So there is this connection of the person with the house, not just in a Makif Harachik, which kind of, till now it sounds like we're trying to say a Makif Harachik has nothing to do with the person. No, it absolutely has what to do with the person. And again, quoting Rabbi Klein, Rabbi Yosef Klein, that he says that's the beauty of that story of the Alter Rebbe with Rabbi Pinchas Reizes in the Maimer about the house. That what did he say? That why did I need the house? Because then it's going to give me power. Right? Oh, but I thought the whole Maimer is explaining how it's Makif Harachik. It's about the bittul, it's about the shichacha, it's about the raiva, the raivin. Yeah. And ultimately that raiva, the raivin, and ultimately that Makif Harachik empowers the person. So there needs to still be this connection to the person. And ultimately, that's what we're out for in this mimer. What is this Orin Seif L'Mayel Kates? How do you have something that's stimu, the whole siman, that it's hidden even from Hashem himself, and yet it's begilui? So let's finish up wrapping that together. 3 lines from the bottom. Ella. So yeah, even the Makav HaRachok, it does affect the person. Ella sha'apa'ula eina b'ofen galui. It's just that the effect is not in a revealed and overt way. And let's tie it back to the mashal of the Friedrich Rebbe in Perek Zayin that ultimately this discussion is centered around. Yes, we're not talking about, first of all, for sure, we're not talking about the actual knowledge that the teacher imparts to the student that the student does understand. And we're not even talking about what we described where the teacher says something and the student appreciates that there's something aloof, the student appreciates that there's something that he doesn't get. And the Gemara tells us that after 40 years, and like we said, whatever the 40 years specifically means, but after 40 years, the person will understand. But what does that show, as we explained earlier in the Maimer, that he's not relearning it after 40 years. No, he's getting what was said then because he always had a connection to it and a conscious connection to it. A connection that he was aware that he didn't understand it. Because that was Makief HaKarov. In Makief HaKarov, you appreciate that there's something there even though you know that it's greater than you. Ella, but now we're talking about Makav HaRachok, page Chavbeis, Ella ba'ofen she'ein royev, afilu ein margish, she'nishar einin shelo yisigoi. Here we're talking about something that's being given over, that you don't see, that you don't feel that there is something that you don't get. Liyois Makav HaRachok, that's Makav HaRachok. But again, what we're saying here is that Makav HaRachok is being given over. So where are we now in the bigger scheme of the Maimer? Technically, right back where we were before Siv Daled, just with a lot more words. In the bigger scheme of the Maimer, we want to understand how you could have this level of Makav HaRachok / Orin Seif L'Mayel Kates / Stimu D'Chol Simin / the stuff that the teacher, or before the mashal, the things that are hidden even from Hashem himself, Kaviyachol. How do you have that? If that was the punchline, okay, I don't know. Yeah, there's these great high stuff. But within all those words, there is an element how it's given over to you. It's pile on you. So to explain that, the Friedrich Rebbe came with the mashal of the seichel of the Rav and the Talmud. And he says, yeah, there's a seichel that the Rav gives over to the Talmud that the Talmud isn't even aware of, right? And he's not even aware that he's not aware. Shkoyach, right? That didn't explain anything. He just used more words that are also not, how could it be given over? How is something given over if it's not there? How's it given over if the person's not even aware that it's not that he's not aware of it? So what is given over? 1 second. So for that we went into a discussion of Makav, and what's very interesting about this Maimer is that we have so many oisis now. You know, the Makav HaKarov, Makav HaRachok, the Levush, the Bayis, the Nasa, the Nishmah, the Ratzin, the Bittul, and in all those sugyas, mini sugyas, we get it. We get how, like, yes, there's something that's so powerful and so beyond the person's mitzias, but it's still connected to the person's mitzias. For example, and again, in Avodah, as we focus on this in this paragraph, that there's the Avodah of the person being mevatel himself to the point that he's not a mitzias, but yet he's still doing the mitzvah, right? So in all of those like mini explanations, we get this fusion, we get this like kind of paradox. But ultimately, we're bringing all this to tie back to, so too with this seichel, there's this Makav HaRachok seichel that's being given over, but it's not even being given over. It's being given over, but not in a way of any form of grasping, not in a form of any way of actual tangible connection, not even a Makiftika connection. Okay, so how do you explain that? So stop giving me more oisias. Not stop, but like, okay, so we appreciate all the other mishalim, all the other dugmais, and yes, in Avodah especially. But in the haskala, in the tifkite of this mashal that the Friedrich Rebbe is using in this parak, which ultimately that's a mashal for Orin Seif L'Mayel Kates, how it's able to be L'Mayel Kates, and yet it's an or, it's an expression. How does that work in the nimshal? How does that work there? So in that sense, we're back to where we started. In other words, we still need to explain, and that's where Sifhei picks up. That's exactly where Sifhei picks up. Finally, the Rebbe goes into the mashal and explains it again, continuing in Perek Zayin. Continuing in Perek Zayin, we're going to show that that's really what we want to unpack over here. That's the depth of what we want to unpack over here. How something that cannot be given over is being given over.